Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Tonight we are honored to have as our guest Robert Spencer, the director of JihadWatch.org and the author of Sumter Gambit, How the Left is Trying to Foment a Civil War. We'll be talking all about his new book as well as other important topics, so don't go anywhere. Before we bring Robert on, I want to take a moment to talk about the controversial new movie that just came out, Civil War. My producer and I, along with our wives, took the time to go see this movie, so when we did talk about it, it would be from firsthand perspective. I can only describe this, quote, movie as left-wing garbage. The only two good points it made, whether intentional or not, were pretty obvious. One being that a civil war would be a terrible thing for this country, and two, that many people will keep their head in the sand for as long as possible. Kevin, what were your thoughts about the movie?
Hey, Dave, thanks for having me on. I just have a few notes right here, just a couple of little notes, but just want to say there's a spoiler alert, so if anybody hasn't seen the movie, you might want to plug your ears because we're going to talk about some things that would spoil it for you. But I don't know about you, Dave, but I went in with high hopes of a well-made movie. I thought that this was going to be a well-done, thought-out movie, but I was totally disappointed. It turned out to be, in my opinion, just pure trash. It's worse than any Hallmark movie that you've ever seen. I'd rather watch a week's worth of Hallmark movies than to watch this thing. There was zero effort made to tell any kind of a backstory of what was going on. When you walked into the movie, it was just started right smack in the middle of it. Right. And the only kind of backstory was a mention of the president's third term, which is what the left always claimed that Trump would do. So it automatically made you think about that. And they paired California with Texas as the secessionists, which I found weird. It's like, I think it was so you couldn't point any fingers. I bet they originally wrote the movie as California and New York, the liberal states as the secessionists to fight against Trump. And they painted Christians as dumb rednecks who torture people and leave them hanging to suffer, which was very disappointing to me. There was a lot of gratuitous violence in there, and it added nothing to the storyline. There's that one scene with a mass grave in it, and you couldn't make heads or tails on which side he was fighting for. Could you, Dave?
Not really.
No,
Not really.
It just didn't make sense. And they pandered to the minority left. There was a black woman in the military that shot the president after he was pleading for his life.
Yep.
Yeah. Then they posed with them with smiles like they just got done with an African safari. And they prize bag, trophy bag.
Right.
Just a couple more.
Yeah. Well, and I agree on, especially on that last scene. I'm like, we know how much the left hates Trump. You can't tell me, even though his name was never mentioned. Yeah. You can't tell me that wasn't just a leftist fantasy about taking out Trump. That's how I interpreted that last part.
Absolutely. And the only realistic thing was how well they treated the media and how they used it to advance their cause.
Right.
Just like the media, or just like the left uses the media now with the mass media and the three major networks. As a movie maker myself, there was a lack of any well-written dialogue, which I found very distressing. Every other word was a four-letter word, needlessly. Right. But
and usually the same one.
Yeah. You know which one.
Yeah.
But that's my take on it. Thank you for wanting to know.
Okay. Well, now to our guest. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He is the author of 28 books, including New York best time sellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad, the bestseller, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, and more recently his book, Sumter Gambit, How the Left is Trying to Foment a Civil War. Mr. Spencer has led seminars on Islam and jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, United States Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and the U.S. intelligence community. He has discussed jihad, Islam, and terrorism at a workshop sponsored by the U.S. State Department and the German Foreign Ministry. He is a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy. He is a regular columnist for PJ Media and Front Page Magazine, has written many hundreds of articles about jihad and Islamic terrorism. His articles on Islam and other topics have appeared in the LA Times, San Francisco Examiner, New York Post, Washington Times, the Dallas Morning News, Fox News, and numerous other publications. He's also served as a contributing writer to the investigative project on terrorism and as adjunct fellow with the Free Congress Foundation. Thank you so much, Mr. Spencer, for being on with us today. We're glad to have you. And how are you doing today?
Just great. Thank you, Dave. Good to see you.
Good to see you. You're really swamped. We're going to get right to this. I'm just curious, have you happened to have time to see the garbage movie we referenced?
I haven't, but I wasn't in the least surprised by the review, because once you see that this is the one Obama is behind, right?
I'm not sure on that, but I could believe that it was.
Yeah, and it's just the kind of thing that the left does.
Right.
They are trying to portray patriotic American conservatives as being insurrectionists, as traitors, as the real threat. It's a gigantic exercise in projection, because that's exactly what they are.
Right, absolutely. So in your book, The Sumter Gambit, How the Left is Trying to Foment Civil War, you explain the how and why of what the left is doing. So what are some examples of how the left is trying to foment a war, and what is their overall goal?
Well, in the first place, for example, you can take the legal persecution of President Trump. Now, whatever somebody may think of President Trump, it seems to me that if there are any patriotic Americans left in the Democrat Party, if there are never Trump Republicans, everybody should be upset about what they're doing to Trump. Because, for example, right now he's on trial for campaign finance violations. And, you know, Hillary Clinton, Obama, and Biden were all found guilty of campaign finance violations. They were never hauled into court. They were never humiliated like this. They were never threatened with prison. They were just fined, and they paid the fines, and that was the end of it. And so even if there is merit, and there actually is not merit in this instance, to these charges, what they're doing to him is so incredibly disproportionate compared to what they did to Democrat political leaders, including presidents, for exactly the same kind of offense. Then you have the finance business, the elevation of misdemeanors into felonies by the DA in New York, Alvin Bragg, on spurious grounds, when he, as the DA, it treats numerous felonies as if they were misdemeanors when they're committed by other people. But when it comes to Trump, suddenly he's Mr. Law and Order, and he's going to upgrade the penalty regarding these offenses. It's very clear that what we have is exactly what Trump calls it, a witch hunt. Now, the point of all this is to ultimately criminalize dissent in the United States and make the political arena be a place where only the point of view of the Democrat Party and the dominant left can be enunciated. What's happening to Trump, in other words, is just the forerunner of what will happen to any American who sticks his neck out in the future and goes up against these people in a way that threatens them. And so what we have in America right now is something we have never had before. For example, Joe Biden, he made that infamous red and black speech. You remember that one? Where he stood before this very ominous background
Yes.
that was red and black colors with a couple of Marines behind him. There's never been a president of the United States since 1789 who has stood in front of military men to make a speech. Not during World War I, not during World War II, not any other time. Why did Biden do it? And why was the backdrop so ominous, the red and black colors? Well, red and black were the colors of the Nazis. And so I don't think that it was any accident. These people are not idiots. They were sending a message that they were trying to convey, I think, the message that Trump, just like this movie that you guys were talking about before, that Trump is a threat to democracy, he's like the Nazis, and so on. But at the same time, what Biden did was telegraph that he himself is the enemy of the Republican rule that Americans have enjoyed since 1776. That what we have is a government now where the president has said that his principal opponent, Trump, and all of the supporters of Trump, that is what Biden calls MAGA Republicans, they represent a threat to the very foundations of the republic. That's what he said during this speech. And so he's standing there in front of the military, and he's lit up like a totalitarian leader, and he's saying that half of the electorate in the United States is out of bounds for American politics. That's never happened in America before. And what we have is a massive threat to what the Democrats always call our democracy, but it's really a republic. And the threat is coming from Biden and his people, not from Trump. They are trying very clearly to criminalize dissent. It's not just the persecution of Trump, which, as many people have pointed out, is like what happens in a banana republic. But it's also, take, for example, the fact that there were people, parents, good patriotic American parents, who were worried about their children in schools because there were drag queens coming into public schools and teaching all kinds of perversion and depravity. And there was critical race theory being taught in schools in areas where there had been racial harmony for decades. And then these people come into the schools and they start teaching all this nonsense that is designed to divide Americans from one another. And these parents went to school board meetings and started to protest. And what did the Biden administration do? Did it say, yeah, you got a point. We're going to not teach this critical race theory and send these drag queens into public schools anymore? No. What they did instead was open up terrorism investigations against these parents for daring to question what's going on in the public schools. Once again, this is the kind of thing that happens in totalitarian states and never has happened before in the United States of America. You have also the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has been at the forefront of the pro-life movement ever since 1973, when Roe v. Wade was passed and abortion was forced upon all 50 states. And the Roe v. Wade decision was overturned, and it was thrown back to the states just 2 years ago. And the Catholic Church, many Catholics, not really the church itself, but many Catholics started to work for pro-life legislation in various states. What did the Biden administration do? Did it say, well, we agree with you, but we understand that you have a right to agitate for your own political views? No. What they did was send spies into Catholic churches in order to try to find pro-lifers and once again frame them as terrorists. This is an out-of-control rogue regime. Another thing that they did, do you remember Hunter Biden's laptop?
Oh, yeah.
That was full of all that smut and all that evidence, much more important than the smut, evidence of his dealings with foreign governments to sell influence and access to his father. And he goes on a crack binge. He's stoned out of his mind. He leaves the laptops, 2 of them, in a computer repair shop and forgets that they're there. And so the laptop ultimately is turned over to the FBI by John Paul MacIsaac, the owner of the computer repair store. And what happens? Did an investigation begin into corruption in the Biden administration and the Biden family? Of course not. What happened instead was that 51 top intelligence professionals in the United States government, and Dave, I'm not talking about some nameless officials in some office cubicle. I'm talking about former heads of the CIA, John Brennan, Michael Hayden, James Clapper, who is the director of national intelligence. These are the top people in the intelligence community in the United States. And they signed on to a document saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. If people had gotten the message about what was on that laptop and how the Biden crime family has been selling America down the river for its own profit for years, then Biden might not have been elected. Now, of course, the election is another thing. But the point that I'm making right now is that they labeled the laptop, which was absolutely real, excuse me, they labeled it disinformation. And that's how it was reported all over the place in the fall of 2020 before the election. And then only after the election did it come out that the laptop was not disinformation, was not some product of the Russians, but was absolutely real. Those intelligence agents have not been discredited. They have not had to resign from any positions they now hold. They have not lost their security clearances. Nothing. Nothing has happened to them. And even worse, the administration tried to set up a disinformation governance board within the Department of Homeland Security. Now, Dave, the fact that it was in the Department of Homeland Security is extremely ominous, because what they were saying was that this alleged disinformation was going to be treated like they treated the parents at the school board meetings, as if we were terrorists. And the idea would be that people who spread disinformation, what the government said was disinformation, even though we know they're liars, like they were with Hunter's laptop, that they would be treated as terrorists. Now, they had to stand down on the Disinformation Governance Board because there was a public outcry about it, and people were pointing out how much in violation of the First Amendment this really was. But what we have here is very clearly an administration that wants to be an authoritarian regime and is very much pushing America in that direction. Now, they might be afraid that there will be a civil war as a result of their own actions, even though they're trying to portray Trump as this guy who wants to be a dictator and this terrible threat to the republic. That's what they really are. And so they know full well that there are some Americans who might rebel and might stand up and say, no, you're not going to turn this country into the next Soviet Union. You're not going to get away with it. But they are actually ready for that, and they wouldn't mind that at all, because then they would have their points proven. I haven't even mentioned, because I could go on for hours, and I know that that's not how these things work. So I'll try to wrap this up, Dave, and thank you for your patience in letting me go on this long. But the point is, of course, the January 6th insurrection and all that was trumped up, and it was all full of the Capitol area was all full of feds who were goading people to go inside the Capitol, and then the police opened the doors to the Capitol building and then prosecute the people who go in there. It was very clearly a setup. And the idea here also is to say we're all insurrectionists, American patriots who value America as a free society. And so if people rise up against this authoritarian regime or wannabe authoritarian regime, then they can say, see, they really are insurrectionists, just like we've been saying. And it would prove their point. We would play right into their hands. And that's why this is an extremely dangerous and delicate era and a difficult situation, because they are trying to push us into rebelling. So that will prove their point about what they've been saying about us. And we have to fight back, but we have to fight back very carefully and very, very shrewdly within the bounds of the law in every way and peacefully, so that we don't give them any ammunition they can use against us.
A couple things there. So in reference to Trump, obviously nobody's been treated as unfairly as him, with the exception, I would say, of some of the J6 prisoners. But he's somebody who has the resources to hire the best lawyers, and as many as he needs. But the average person, they would have been under the jail a long time ago. And I think that's part of the reason they have gone all out against him, because the average person realizes, wow, if they can do this to a former president who is very well off financially, I've got no chance. I've got no legal chance if they want to push something against me. So I think that's another thing that they do that's intentional, to send that message of don't even think about it.
No doubt about it whatsoever, Dave. Absolutely. This is designed, like Trump has said, it's not me they're after, it's you. I'm just in the way. But you're absolutely right. This is a man who can fight back. And of the suicides among some of the people who've been persecuted for January 6th is a very, very disquieting indication that not everybody is in that position, not everybody can fight back. And this absolutely amoral, unscrupulous, evil administration has pushed some people beyond the edge and persecuted, destroyed the lives of people for relatively innocuous actions on January 6, 2021. And they had no recourse. They were not billionaires, and they can't hire the best lawyers.
Well, and another thing about that is the people that can't do anything. Once something happens, once there's just one little incident, I don't think they will wait for some sort of general insurrection. They will create one. I mean, they created the whole January 6th thing. I would not put it past them to create a false flag. One of the things that really bothers me about the J6 situation, though, is you don't hear much from our elected officials about it. Very few elected officials have even bothered to visit the J6 prisoners or to make it an issue. And I suspect that a lot of them, and I've been told this by certain people, that even our elected officials are afraid to say too much about the J6 people, or afraid to side with them because they're afraid that they will be targeted.
Yeah, they'll be tarred as insurrectionists or as sympathetic to the insurrection, and then all kinds of legal persecution could follow for them as well. Now, it's a shame that we don't have more people of courage in Washington, because it is an outrageous scandal what's being done to these people, these January 6th defendants. And a lot, you have people who are in prison for walking in when the doors were open and snapping some selfies and walking out. And this ought to have been job one for the congressmen of every district that these people were from. But like you say, the political cost is very high, and that's just where the left has set it.
Yeah. So one of the things that about this movie too is I thought it was a very unrealistic scenario. But if they are able to, I guess, goad us into a civil war, or if there's no alternative, how would you see a civil war playing out? I mean, I don't think it would be anything like we imagine. I think we're talking about some sort of third world nightmare if we were to actually have a civil war in this country.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Look, the first Civil War in America was really very neat in a certain sense. I mean, of course, it was the bloodiest war in American history. I'm not meaning to minimize that. But geographically, you had two regions of the country fighting against each other. This Civil War, right, and God forbid that it breaks out. We hope that it does not. But if it comes to that, that's not such a neat geographical division now. And people say, oh, yeah, sure there is. Just give the blue states to the leftists and the red states to the patriots. And that's easy to say. But the fact is, I was just recently, last couple weeks, speaking in California several times and meeting with very ardent patriots who've lived there all their lives, who were part of the Republican Party of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And they are appalled at what's happened to their state and what's happening to the country, but they're not gone. A lot of people think, oh, everybody, 100% in California, they're all far out, crazy, wingnut leftists. Well, yeah, a lot of them are. But you're still talking 35, 40% of the state would vote solidly for Trump, solidly for any patriotic candidate. And that's not enough to elect anybody.
Right.
And so they don't have, they actually do have quite a few congressmen, but they don't have senators. And they certainly aren't going to go for a Republican candidate in a presidential election anytime soon. But the idea that California would just go with the left in a civil war ignores the fact that there are so many patriots still there. And it's the same thing in New York, same thing in New England. And so it could be extraordinarily bloody and difficult. It could be a matter of fighting like the Liberian Civil War in the 1990s, which was incredibly bloody because it was house to house, neighborhood to neighborhood, street to street. You didn't have a neat geographical division.
Right.
And so, also, something else, Dave, about this that's important to bear in mind. People think, oh, if there's a civil war, you've got the Americans on the one side who understand the importance of the Second Amendment, know how to defend themselves, and own guns against a bunch of guys who think they're women. It's not going to be difficult. And, put that way, yeah, it seems like it would be a cakewalk. But the fact is that the guys who think they're women are in charge of everything. Not just them, but the ones who are their allies.
Right.
And so they have the military.
Yep. And
they have the police forces of the major cities. And people say, oh, the police, they won't do that. If they're told to fire upon American citizens, their own families and friends and neighbors, they won't do it. And I think, well, I certainly hope you're right about that. And I think that there's no doubt that that's true of some. But unfortunately, it is also true, and I think we have to admit it, that a lot of people who are in the police and in the military will go along with whatever they're told to do.
Absolutely.
And that's quieting lessons of World War II, and the Germans saying when they were on trial at Nuremberg, I was only following orders. It was Hitler and Goering and Himmler told me to do these things. And so I did them. And Americans, I remember learning about that in school, and we would say, oh, we would never do that. We would stand up against orders if they were unjust. And I think, well, I'm not sure that spirit is universal in America anymore. And unfortunately, it's not like we're made of better stuff than the Germans. Human nature is always the same everywhere around the world. And there are people who are cowardly. There are people who are self-serving. There are people who are short-sighted among all nations. And so, unfortunately, they would carry along a lot of the military and the police, if not the great majority of it. And so it could be very ugly.
Well, just look at the bonus army in our country in the early 1930s. This was after World War I, but during the Great Depression, when you had all these World War I veterans who'd been promised a bonus camping out close to the White House. And they decided, hey, we got to get rid of all these people. Now, this was not just veterans. It included their families were with them, and they were in tents and shanties and whatever. And who did they send in there to get rid of them? It was MacArthur and Patton, if I remember correctly, and I want to say Eisenhower was involved in that as well. So anybody that thinks the majority of our military or our law enforcement won't do what they're told when the time comes, I think you're deceiving yourselves. And I'll tell you, too, with the military, and I am prior service, so as soon as something happens, it's a whole new ball game. As soon as there's something, some sort of clash, it's a whole new ball game. All right, and so people need to keep that in mind. If you are trusting that law enforcement and the military would never fire on Americans, would never take any kind of action like that, you're deceiving yourself. One other thing I wanted to get into about what the left is doing. A lot of people don't realize that there is a red-green alliance, or I call it the Marxist and Muslim alliance in America. Can you talk about how they work together some?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the strangest things about the contemporary scene, and I can tell you that over the last 20, 25 years, speaking around the country, people have asked me that many, many times. They say, how is it that you can have this alliance between the left and Islam when Islam upholds a very strict morality and the left is so libertine and so out of control, as we see increasingly? And I think that what we need to realize is that this is a very deep alliance that is based on a shared view of society. Now, people might be surprised to hear that they have a shared view of society, but they do. Because think about the left. Every time the radical left has gained power anywhere in the world, it imposes authoritarian rule. And I just went on and on about how Biden and his people are authoritarians as well, and they're leftists. leftism is inherently authoritarian and against free societies. And you can see that in the French Revolution. You can see that in the Russian Revolution, in the establishment of the Soviet Union. You can see that with the establishment of communist China. And in Vietnam, after the South Vietnamese fell and the communists took over the whole country, every place that the radical left has come to power, there's a reign of terror, and they establish an authoritarian regime. Now, in a lot of those places, they tried to stamp out religion. In the French Revolution, they did it, and in the early days of the Soviet Union, they did it. In Vietnam, they did it. I think they did it in China as well. But in every case where authoritarian regimes have tried to stamp out religion, they have found that the religious impulse is too strong and they can't beat it. Now, the thing about that is, Dave, that there is one religion that says, obey the ruler no matter what. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said, obey your ruler even if he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. Now, that is a statement that he made that is often quoted by people saying, see, look, Muhammad was a terrible racist. He said this thing about Ethiopians. And that's true. But I think what's even more important about that passage is that Muhammad is saying, obey your ruler, even if he's the most outlandish person I can think of, that is, Muhammad can think of, this Ethiopian. And so he's saying, obey your ruler no matter what, which is just what authoritarian regimes want their people to think, that no matter what the guy in power does, we don't complain, we don't protest, we certainly don't overthrow him, we just go along. And so, if you have people who want to establish an authoritarian regime, and you know you can't stamp out religion, you're going to encourage Islam. Yeah. Because Islam is the one religion that will go along with your attempts to establish an authoritarian regime. Not only that, but these people are are internationalists. They hate nation states. We can certainly see that they hate the American nation state, which is the foremost nation state in the world, because they've opened up the border. Millions of people have come in, over 7 million people in the last 3 years. And they are working hard to destroy our national character and our national unity. And the whole idea of that is to ultimately to establish an international authoritarian state that will be larger than the United States of America. And what religion is also international and says you should have loyalty to the religion above loyalty to any particular nation, and that's Islam. So Islam lends itself to both authoritarianism and internationalism, and the left is authoritarian and internationalist, so they love each other.
Well, and we have this going on in our country already. You wrote an article recently about the situation in Dearborn, where you have this imam from Dearborn, and they are chanting, the people are chanting, death to America. That's happening in Dearborn, Michigan. And so they're already here. They've been here. Matter of fact, the sad thing is that all these years after 9/11, we don't have fewer Muslims here, we have more. We don't have fewer mosques, we have more. They don't have less power, they have more power. And our government has allowed this, I guess you could say, it facilitated it. So I don't know if people realize how much they work together and how much of a threat they are, because they are a violent religion and they fit really well with the Marxist.
Very much so. And you know something else? The mayor of Dearborn, Abdullah Hamoud, who is a Muslim mayor, and he has appeared with many people who have praised terrorist groups at various public appearances and rallies and so on. And after the Death to America chants in Dearborn went around and people heard about them, he didn't say, I'm going to investigate these people and I'm going to put a stop to this. He just said, Dearborn is full of patriotic Americans who love this country. Well, that's great, but that doesn't get to the heart of the problem. He didn't say he was going to do anything about the people who were chanting death to America. And here again, we see it. He's a leftist, Muslim, Democrat mayor. And so that kind of talk is really something that just doesn't bother him at all. It's in line with the ultimate goals of the groups that he's part of.
And early on after 9/11, I know we mentioned as part of your biography, you worked with the federal government at the time to educate our law enforcement and intelligence agencies on the threat of Islam and their ideology and how it's incompatible with our Constitution. Well, that's not happening anymore, obviously, and I don't think it's happened for quite some time. But the FBI will certainly go after groups like the Oath Keepers and infiltrate them. And I don't know all of the deal. I'm not a member of the Oath Keepers, although I think we should all keep our oath. I'll put it that way. But look how the feds went after them, after just basically, ex-military, ex-law enforcement, and others who, were concerned about what's going on in our country, and yet they were infiltrated by the federal government and they were targeted. And so now I don't think I know their leader is in jail as part of the J6 debacle, but it's a shame that we have such dangerous groups in here, dangerous Islamist groups, and nothing happens to them, but they'll go after patriotic groups like the Oath Keepers.
Well, Dave, that all fell out. It all unfolded back in 2011. In 2011, yeah, you're right. I used to train FBI and military groups about the mindset of terrorists. I would take them through the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, and the life of Muhammad so that they would understand what the motives and goals and the mindset was of the people they were trying to deal with. Anyway, I was fired in 2011, and that was when the Obama administration actually took out all mention of Islam from counter-terror training. And I was fired and other people were fired at the time because we were talking about Islam in connection with terrorism. And John Brennan, who was at that time in the Homeland Security Department and later became the head of the CIA and an expert on Russian disinformation, he assured these Muslim groups who had complained about me teaching and other things that that all mention of Islam would be removed from anything having to do with terrorism. And the Obama administration established the Countering Violent Extremism program, the CVE program. And they said that they were fighting violent extremists. Now, if you looked at the CVE website at the time, they never exactly explained who the violent extremists were. And as it turns out, now we know that it was an intentionally vague phrase that they can use against anybody they don't like. Yep. And so we saw the Biden administration treating the parents at the school board meetings that way. These people are violent extremists, and they can turn that phrase against anybody they want. It doesn't matter if you're not violent. They just will use it as a catch-all to just focus on, target, and destroy anybody who dissents from their agenda and is in their way.
If I'm not mistaken, this was after Major Hassan killed all those soldiers at Fort Hood, or it was in that general time frame.
Yeah, I believe that was in 2009, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
Now I'm going from memory, and I may not have that right, but I believe it was in 2009 that Major Hassan killed 13 people at Fort Hood, and it was definitely in 2011 that 57 Muslim and South Asian organizations wrote to Brennan demanding I be fired and demanding that Islam be removed from counter-terror training. And he immediately wrote back and said, oh, yeah, we'll get right on this. And they did it. They completely redesigned the whole government approach to terrorism. And so, it's funny now when I read, and you can still probably, even today, you can find them, articles with Muslim groups and Muslim leaders saying how terrible it was that they get targeted by counter-terror efforts. That's just a complete lie. They haven't been targeted in counter-terror efforts for 13 years now. And before that, it was hit and miss. And there was, you mentioned how the Muslim population in the United States has grown since 9/11. That was a concerted effort, and the U.S. government was making extra efforts not to appear Islamophobic after 9/11. And so there was an awful lot more outreach from the government to Muslim groups than investigation of Muslim groups after 9/11. Now, certainly they did catch some terrorist groups, and they shut down the Holy Land Foundation that was funding Hamas. But a lot of groups with ties to terror groups had influence and still have tremendous influence within the United States government.
Absolutely. Hey, what are some of the other things that the left is doing to provoke people?
Well, a lot of it has to do with culture wars. And, I mentioned the drag queens in the public schools. It's amazing, Dave, if you think about it. Nowadays, we're kind of used to it, and you grow used to anything if it just keeps on going, unfortunately. But if you had said, you and I had been talking 10 years ago, and I had said in 10 years, there's going to be regular drag queen programs talking about all kinds of deviance and perversion in public schools and in public libraries, talking to little kids. And a lot of people are going to say that if you try to shut this down, that you're some kind of Nazi. And you would have said, oh, no, that's crazy. That'll never happen. That's going too far. And here we are. And the idea, once again, is that if you fight back, then you will give them ammunition to portray us all as insurrectionists. We've seen this in Texas several times. Texas, which is a very pivotal red state, a bastion of American patriots. And not only have there been these drag queen shows for children in Texas, but also there have been armed Antifa, armed leftist thugs outside these events while the police just stand there and do nothing. And if anybody goes to protest, anybody says, we're going to go in and we're going to keep this event from happening and keep these children from being victimized, then the armed Antifa thugs get in the way and issue threats and are physically intimidating, and nothing is done. Now, this is obviously an orchestrated effort, and it's trying to push us so far as to do something that will give them ammo once again.
Yeah. And it goes back to what you said earlier, it wouldn't be near like the first Civil War, which was mostly geographical, not completely, but more so now. It varies, because here, even in Tennessee, Tennessee is a red state as far as most of the people go. All right. But, our politicians are purple. And all of our urban areas are far left. Nashville is pretty much San Fran on the Cumberland. It's just as crazy as any place. And we have just as many wacko leftists here. Our Democrat Party here is just as crazy as any Democrat Party. The left here is just as sick and depraved as the rest of the country where they have leftists. So they've taken over all the metro areas, even in Tennessee. So that's another thing. And the type of things that you're talking about, 10 years ago, I would have imagined, okay, maybe in San Francisco, maybe in New York, but I would not have imagined it here. And it's happening here, and it seems like we can't even get our state to stop it.
Indeed. And this is because we have compromised officials, leftist officials, and the elections are compromised, and the whole thing has been very carefully thought out. You got to give them credit. They've covered all the bases.
Right.
And so I'm not saying there's no hope. I'm not saying there's nothing that can be done. And I think especially in states like Tennessee, a lot of pressure can be brought to bear at the ballot box against these people, even if it is, once again, a border state as it was in the first Civil War. Still, there are enough people there who may be able to throw the bums out and put in some people who will put a stop to this. I certainly hope so.
Yeah. Well, we have a Republican supermajority, but it's supermajority in number only. We do have some good legislators, and we do have some trying to fix these things, but it's really frustrating in a state that has a Republican supermajority that we still have to put up with this garbage, and that we can't get it squashed out. I've got one last question for you. The
Yes,
left
sir.
now controls so many institutions that voting alone, even if we could trust elections, it's not going to restore our country to sanity and constitutional government. How do we restore our country, in your opinion?
Well, you're right. Voting is not the only thing that's going to do it, although we do have to work to try to restore the integrity of our elections and then win the elections. Yeah. And then the what we have to do, actually, Dave, is imitate how the left took over. And there was the long march through the institutions, which was a phrase that was circulating around in the 60s. You may remember, or maybe only old men like me will remember, that in the 60s, there were all the hippies, and they were occupying the offices. That's what they did in those days, occupying offices of college presidents and demanding curriculum changes and that the college do various things that they wanted. And most of the time, they didn't get anywhere. And so they smartened up. And instead of holding sit-ins in college presidents' offices, they became the college professors. And they began what was called the Long March through the institutions. And one professor would get hired, and then he would get on the hiring committee and hire another one who thought the way he did. And now here we are 50 years later, and they've taken over all the colleges and universities. And they are all radioactive wastelands of far-left indoctrination, with very few exceptions. And so instead of being institutions of higher learning, we have them turning out leftist, brainwashed leftist young people who become their cadres and the shock troops, you know, the kind of people who join Antifa and then stand out and guard the drag queen shows. But anyway, we have to do the same thing and start to take back the universities, take back the school system, take back the culture. And it's not going to be an immediate process. And the whole thing could come to a head and come to a bigger conflict before this is done. But the point is, every American has to start to become an activist. Every patriotic American has to realize the government's not going to help us. The police aren't going to help us. Military's not going to help us. It's up to us to become activists, every last one of us. And in our sphere of life, legally, peacefully, patriotically, we have to start to take it back. And if we're in education or in entertainment or in whatever field we're in, we start to stand for the right values, to spread the right values, and to bring other people on who will also do the same thing.
Well, hey, once again, thank you very much for coming on. I know you're very busy, so I do appreciate you taking the time, and I'd love to have you back sometime.
Thank you very much, Dave. Much appreciated. And yeah, call me anytime. We'll set it up.
All right. You have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Just a couple quick updates. House Bill 2802 by Representative Fritz that was going to do away with the intent to go armed clause in our Tennessee Code annotated. That was going to be heard in full criminal justice committee today. That got rolled to next week. So if you're able to make it to that committee meeting next week, please do so. Go to the Tennessee Firearms Association website. You can get more details on that. Remember, if you're not instructing your state legislators on important issues, they are still being instructed by feckless state leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, numerous lobbyists, and other well-heeled scum that roam the halls of the Capitol. Next week, our guest will be Don Barnett, a fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies who lives here in Tennessee. Don just returned from our out-of-control border and will give us an update on who might be coming to Tennessee. Hope you'll join us. Now, before I sign off tonight, I've got to just make a little administrative note here. I lost a bet. That's why I'm wearing this jacket. No, I'm just kidding. The producer from day one has wanted me to wear a sports coat, and it's not really something I normally do, but I agreed to do it. And so give us your feedback, good, bad, or ugly. Not saying I'll do it again, but if you were wondering why it's on, that's why it's on. Anything to say on that, Kevin?
Yeah, I definitely think leave your comments whether we should keep the jacket or lose it. I say keep it. You look fantastic.
Thanks. That's it for now, and good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.